So this is Dr. Jimmy Menkhaus. He teaches theology at Gilmour Academy in Cleveland, down the road with me. What a privilege for me. He's an adjunct member of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at John Carroll University. His dissertation, which was completed at Duquesne University, explored the thoughts of Father Pedro Rupe and solidarity. And this is very exciting. His first book, called Immersion, A Pilgrimage into Service, will be published in January 2022, and he just got an email about it the other day, and we got to sift through the pages, and it was an exciting moment, and I was lucky to be a part of it. I'm also really lucky to work with Jimmy, and I'm grateful that you're all going to see some of the wisdom that I get to see all the time. If you're looking for something creative and funny to bring to your classroom, he's an expert in something called Dino Days. I'll just leave it at that. He has a really hilarious way of drawing in students through tiny little dinosaurs. So if you are looking for something funny and wisdom, he is your guy. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Sadie. I think it was, and hello to our people on Zoom. I know you're far away from me, but hopefully you're able to hear. And if you have any issues, let Miles know in the chat, and he will fix things. So makes me feel old when I realize that people I taught here at John Carroll are now my teaching colleagues. I passed that stage of life. But I want to welcome you all to John Carroll. For those who have not been here before, I spent, in some ways, half my life here in a variety of roles. And it's a wonderful place, and I hope you enjoy your visit. And to those who have been here before or who were students here, welcome back. So when preparing this workshop, I asked a friend of mine who used to work with Dr. Hannenberg, and he looked through the evaluations from previous years. They said, well, what sort of advice do you have from previous feedback on these workshops? And he immediately said, don't talk too much. And I said, that's your best advice? He said, absolutely. Teachers do not want to be talked at for a whole hour. Don't talk too much. So in order to honor the advice that he gave me and to hopefully make this a usable event, a workshop that you can take some things away from this and apply them in your schools, I promise I will not talk too much. So the way I'm thinking of proceeding, I'll share some introductory comments similar to our keynote speaker of around 15 minutes, no more than 20 minutes, and then we'll break up into groups, and Miles, my wonderful assistant back there, will take care of that for the Zooming folks, put you into a small group room, and then for those here, there's about 10 or 12 of us, so probably 2 groups we could split into. And then there'll be some things, food for thought from my comments that you can then share and discuss within these groups, and we'll come back together and kind of share out, and there'll be a system for sharing out for those on Zoom that Miles and I will handle, and then for those in this room, obviously be able to share yourselves. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about why service is important. I'm not going to quote the Bible or church teaching or human experience to try to convince you that service should be an aspect of education at our Catholic schools. Because I think that if you don't think that service should be an aspect, you're probably not sitting through this workshop. So we'll just take for granted the fact that as you do for the least of my sisters and brothers, you do so for me. So I wanted to also begin by offering a few thoughts on the title of the workshop, Examining Service in a Post-Pandemic World. I certainly do not think we are currently in a post-pandemic world, and I want to make that clear, that neither in our country nor around the world can we talk about the pandemic as a thing of the past. Perhaps 7 or 8 months ago, when we all imagined what school would be like when we heard there was a vaccine, thinking to the fall, thinking to a time when the pandemic wouldn't still be an issue for our style of education, we perhaps were hoping that by this fall we would be in a post-pandemic world, but I don't think that we are there. I do have hope that we will one day reach it. There is a dual nature also to the title of the workshop. One, given the slowdown or halting of service and immersion trips or service in our schools, how have we, or how can we, use that time as a time of self-study to ask ourselves, what is it that we do or used to do, and how can we fix or alter or change or adapt things moving forward? This is the area that I will spend most of my time commenting on here in my opening comments, is as a time of self-reflection, how can we look at what we did or are doing and improve in some way in that? But I also want to give service to another important aspect of the presentation and the title, Service in a Post-Pandemic World. And that's that service for many of us has had to be adapted in a radical way. those things that you liked to do, whether they be service in your classrooms, service trips, service programs, working with colleagues, maybe a large service day at your schools, all of that has had to be adapted in a very radical way in this past year and a half. And I think that, in sharing some of that, if your small groups get to those discussions, the ingenuity that I've seen for teachers to make some form of service possible for students, I think is something to be very much celebrated and shared. So what does it look like to try to do service during a pandemic? In those opening months when the pandemic hit and all of our schools immediately went online in March of 2020, we all had to suddenly think, okay, how do we do things anew in a brand new context? And so teaching, we adapted to Zoom and those sorts of things last year. But service, something that by its very nature, doing service entails being with people. And so in what ways were we able to safely modify those sorts of things that first year and then still into this year? So again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that aspect, but I welcome you to share those things in your small group discussions. One of my colleagues recently told me that the pandemic has not only transformed service, but has made the need for service even greater. That we realize the widening gap between those who have and who have not, those schools that were able to quickly adapt and do everything online versus those schools where people had to mail packets to the students because they may not have had internet access at home. And just, again, highlighted the disparity between those who have and those who have not. And also, I think, underlying cultural and racial animosity and distrust that we've certainly seen in the past 2 years. And the pandemic has exacerbated those tensions as well. So again, those are important things to talk about, and I didn't want to gloss over them, but I'm going to go in the other direction in terms of my comments to you. And that was kind of the self-reflection about how we can look at what we did and improve in a post-pandemic world when that arrives. So some of you are likely involved in service programs at your schools in some way, maybe coordinate a club or service program. Perhaps some of you coach, and some of your athletes are people who there's a service day as part of your teams. Others may participate in large service days or trips with advisory groups or something like that. Others perhaps teach aspects of service and social justice in the classroom. And some of you have accompanied perhaps people on immersion trips or mission trips. So within some area of the spectrum of that, I assume that you all either touch upon one of those things or more, or are interested in doing so, and that's why you came to this workshop today. My comments that I'll be giving to you in a moment are my own kind of musings about these things in the past 18 months. As Sadie and Kristen were mentioning earlier, there's a book that I wrote during the pandemic that'll be published in January on immersion trips. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about immersions and service in the past 18 months. And so my comments, some of you may disagree with some of the things that I say, and I welcome that. If you think, no, that isn't really how it is at my school or in my context, please feel free in your small groups and then at the end in our large group sharing to offer what you think, kind of adapting some of the things that I'll say into your own context and situation. So there are 3 points I want to make, finally getting to the meat of the talk. The first is on language, the second is on images, and the third is on environment or place. And I'm going to spend just a few moments talking about each one of those and kind of unpacking what I'm talking about in terms of their application to thinking, again, about service in a post-pandemic world. So language. I like to tell my students, both high school and college students, that language does have meaning in theology, like any other discipline. In science, you don't confuse electrons and protons. I don't really even know much about electrons and protons, but I know that it is a big problem when you confuse them. And so I think that often we talk about theology in a way where we assume that language has less of a meaning than it does in these other disciplines. And I really try to push back with my students. I say, no, language is very important in theology. And if you say something, you should understand what it is that you're meaning. What words are you choosing just as in any other science or discipline? For example, one of the other things that I do is I work with the program Rostri di Cristo, which is out of Boston, and the Jesuit Volunteer Corps International. And I work at their orientation in the summers as they prepare young college graduates to go on and do a year or more of international service. And a couple of years ago, there was a very heated discussion because one of the presenters referred to those who were preparing to do service as missionaries. And this was very early on. It was like the second or third day of a 2-week program. And a number of the volunteers said, we really want to stop here and discuss this. why are you calling us missionaries? And the presenter was pretty surprised because he didn't expect this pushback. And so what led to a half-a-day discussion about what it means to refer to people as missionaries and whether or not this term was applicable to these young adults who were going on to do service. And it was a great discussion. And I think that I learned a lot from that our words have a lot of meaning in terms of the historical connotation. And so these young adults who had just graduated from university were pushing back because of the historical context of missionary. And they said that as they're going into these places where the conquistadors and conquest and baptism by the sword were realities that the people that they were going to be working with faced in their history, that they were very uncomfortable with the label of missionary. This is something that I wouldn't have thought of until they brought this forward. And so I say that because I know that at a lot of our schools, including at Gilmour, they're referred to as mission trips. And so when I'm talking about language, I'm saying as we're labeling, perhaps programs or the way we talk about what we're going to do we have those conversations with our students to say, this is called a mission trip because of this, and this is why we choose, as a school, we choose this label for this program. Because one of the things I've learned about students, and yes, perhaps we complain from time to time that they're always on their phones and they're disconnected, but I think that students are really good at language. I think that they are much more aware than I ever was as a high school student about what words are being used to describe things. The other day, last week, I had two students approach me and kind of say, we want to have a serious talk about some of the language that's being used at Gilmour to refer to certain people. And it was a really powerful discussion where they brought things to light that I hadn't thought of. And I was like, wow, those are really good points that you're making. Let's take this to the next step, and talk to people about it. So I think that students are really aware of language. And I challenge us, myself included, to be more aware of the language and labeling that we have for things at our schools. Another example I offer is, for you, is there a difference between saying, come out on Friday night to feed the homeless versus come out on Friday night to develop fellowship with those experiencing homelessness? So those are two different ways of saying the same activity. The LAVR program, for example, which is at John Carroll, and I know a few other schools in the area, is a program where the students get together and they take food and fellowship to the homeless. But do we refer to them as the homeless or people experiencing homelessness? So again, words have meaning is what I'm trying to kind of offer. As Father Boyle says in Tattoos on the Heart, that we should try to drop the barrier that exists between service recipient and service provider. And I think that modifying some of our language can help us drop that barrier in place, that we often say, we're the ones giving food to you, versus coming together and celebrating our shared humanity. And a number of the points that our keynote address was getting at in terms of beauty and seeing the world. So my first point, again, just to recap, language. We're asking ourselves, is there language that we use, whether in our teaching about service or in our service programs, that could be modified to take a greater awareness of our context and the people that we minister to or teach to? Second point is on images. They say an image is worth 1,000 words. So if language is important, then images must be 1,000 times more important. So what we're going to do, I'm going to use some technology here, which isn't always my strong suit, but we're going to share this. And then Miles, if you would share that image with our Zoomers. And ta-da. Okay. So this is an image of a slightly younger Jimmy Menkhaus. A little bit of a beard here, but I haven't aged a day since this was taken, of course. This is about almost 10 years ago, I guess. And the reason I picked this image is it was on the cover of a service kind of bulletin at John Carroll University. And it was chosen, and I didn't realize it was going to be chosen until I saw it on the cover. But I was quite proud of myself. I was like, wow, I did a service trip, and here they're highlighting me. I was a part-time teacher here, and I may have been a resident minister at this time. And I was like, wow, that's me. So if I were teaching high school or college class, I might put an image up like this and say, what kind of caption would you give this image? So just take a moment and ask yourself, if you were writing the newsletter for the John Carroll newsletter on service, service programming here, what sort of caption might you think? It's likely that the first thought that you had was something like, here's Menkhaus, Dr. Menkhaus, Jimmy, teaching a young child to read. In some ways, that's what was occurring. You can see kind of, I'm pointing at something and he's looking down. But I think that few people would say something like, and maybe some of you did, but I think less than 50% would say something like, small boy showing Jimmy Menkhaus something in his favorite book. Or small boy pointing out something for Jimmy to see and to know more about himself. I think that given it's I told you it was on the cover of a service newsletter, and therefore I'm doing service, that you assume that I'm the one, again, the service provider, and the young boy is the service recipient. And I think that images like this can reinforce stereotypes about what it is that service actually is. Perhaps older helping younger. White person helping black person. Okay? Person who is teacher helping student. But trying to reverse and understand the opposite is also possibly true. But again, when we see images, perhaps, and I'm not going to speak for how you saw this, but I think many people would have thought it one way as opposed to the other way. There's a wonderful image, picture of Pedro Rupe, the former Superior General of the Jesuits, where he's sitting down and a young boy is shining his shoes. And then there's a picture that was taken moments later of Rupe shining the young boy's shoes. And so often in Pedro Rupe literature, there's the two pictures side by side. That here is, the young boy kind of giving the service to Rupe, but then Rupe saying, I'm going to give the service back to you and I'll shine your shoes. So how can we think in terms of that context to perhaps reverse what it is that's often assumed in our images? But even more than that, the reason I wanted to use this image is that only a person who's in the image knows what they were thinking at the time. And I want to share with you, rather embarrassingly, what it is that I was thinking at this time. I was thinking, I really hope someone takes a picture of me while I'm working with these children, so that way I can put it up on social media. It's hard for me to admit that. But Jimmy has learned a lot in 10 years, I hope. But I think that sometimes our students feel that way. They're working at a soup kitchen. They're working with people tutoring or sitting with the elderly. And they think to themselves, wow, I really hope there's some pictures to put on my Instagram account, so that way I can get a bunch of likes. And my question, in terms of, we're talking here about images, is there a way that we can honor the image and not fall into this kind of trap of using images as a way to further our own agenda? Which in this case, again, I didn't know it was going to be on a newsletter, but I definitely knew I was furthering my own agenda. I think that you can have pictures at service. I'm not saying you should never take pictures at service, but I would offer a few thoughts about what might make something more or less appropriate in terms of the use of images at service projects. One, I remember I knew the boy's name when he introduced himself and I sat down, but I didn't remember it after that. There were a couple other kids that I read with during this service project, and I don't remember any of their names either. So I think that the question is, what is the relationship that the people have in the image to each other? Ivan Illich, who has a very strong anti-service talk that he gave in the 1960s, offered this vision that if you jumped into a van with your friends and you drove down to a school and you jumped out and you started playing with random kids, and then you took pictures of you playing with random kids, and then you shared them with a bunch of people to say, look what I'm doing, and you got back in your van and you just drove away, how utterly ridiculous would that be? And since we're all teachers here and I'm not talking to students, I would say, if you're at a bar and you meet someone and you talk for 15 minutes, it would be very odd if you said, oh, can I have a picture with you so I can put it up on social media? And then they just go their separate way. But in our service, sometimes we do service projects with kids or with adults for like a half an hour. And then it's like, well, I really want a picture of you so I can show the world. And then we kind of go our separate ways. So all of this I'm trying to get at is, how can images sometimes do more harm than good in terms of our service? And where is the boundary between appropriate use of images versus inappropriate use? I like to think that doing service, just like doctors should follow the Hippocratic Oath, those doing it. The first objective in service should be to do no harm. If we walk away from a service project and we feel we've done harm, then perhaps we need to reconfigure and think, how can we do this differently? So the second point was images. And the third point I'm going to offer is on environment. So I'm just going to stop sharing. Okay, on environment. And by environment, I kind of mean the place that one is. And in order to give an example of this, I want to offer an experience that I had when I took students to Immokalee, Florida, which is a place in Florida where many of the fruits and vegetables that are picked and taken, shipped throughout the United States comes from, especially tomatoes. I've taken students to Immokalee a number of times. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Some high school groups go down. I've taken college groups down before, but high school groups I know go there as well. And so in Immokalee, if you've ever seen the documentary Food Chains, it's also about Immokalee. In Immokalee, there's this large area called the parking lot where all the migrant workers go to be picked up, and they get on buses, and then they're taken for a half hour to 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, out to the fields, and they pick fruits and vegetables, produce in the fields, and then they come back to the parking lot around 6:30 or 7 at night, and then they get off the buses. And so when you show up at the bus, you don't know necessarily if you're going to be selected for work that day. It's a very powerful experience as discussed in the Food Chains documentary. And so one of the things that our community partners, the Humility of Mary volunteers, would ask us to do in Immokalee, the last day we would take students to the parking lot, and we would sit in these vans on the grounds of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, their union, and we would watch the workers go to work in the morning. And the first year that I did this, it was incredibly powerful for me and the students, and it's kind of like that key moment in the immersion where you're like, wow, I put it all together. I've been learning about injustice and immigration policy and workers' rights all week, and now I'm watching, as the people get on these buses. And so a few years go by, and then I am, a faculty member here working with students and taking them down, and another faculty member pulled me aside, and she said, well, what are we doing tomorrow morning? It's our last day. I said, well, we're going to the parking lot. We're going to be, observing people go to work. And she was just aghast. She was like, we're doing what? I said, well, this is a really important moment for the students and blah, 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 and it's really powerful. And she's like, so you're going to sit in unmarked white vans across the street from a group of migrant workers, many of whom are probably undocumented, and watch them go to work at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And of course, at the time, as I said, I've learned a lot in my years, I thought that was totally fine. I said, yes, we are. And she said, I refuse to do so. And she was one of the van drivers. And she said, I will not drive a van and sit in this and sit across the street from them. So my perspective was that we had always done this. It's always done this way. And this is the big moment for the students. This is something that the students really will learn from. And her perspective was, you are marginalizing, stereotyping, and endangering people. And this is the time when the ICE raids were even more prevalent in Immokalee. People were afraid to go outside to get food at the local church because they were so afraid of being picked up by ICE. Again, a number of these folks were undocumented. And so her perspective was thinking from the experience of the people, and mine was thinking from the experience of the students. I now agree with her and think that it's utterly absurd that I ever did this. But it took a long time for me to come to terms with and think about how the environment has kind of shaped a change. Not that it was maybe ever right to begin with. And the reason it was so hard, because our community partner, the people, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, told us to do this, and we were on their property. And so we had, the full support of the people on the ground who know things far better than us to do this. And yet there was this pushback. So one of the things in terms of environment that I'm going to ask you to consider is, what do you do when you're in a situation where you're taking students somewhere, whether a place in Cleveland, somewhere else, and the community partner is asking you to do something that you think is objectifying or marginalizing the people that you're supposed to serve? Because again, it kind of smacks of the superiority complex or savior complex when you're like, no, I know what's better for you in this context than you do, even though I'm a visitor. But at the same time, there is a tension there that I felt in this case, and that I assume that some of you might have an experience like that, where you're like, I just don't think that this is the right thing to do. And I'm not talking unethical. I don't think what I was taking students there was unethical. I think it was kind of dumb. But I don't think I crossed ethical lines. So obviously, if a community partner asks you to do something unethical, that's a different situation. But I'm talking about that gray area where you're like, this just doesn't feel right. and how do you approach that with a community partner? So my comments, I hope, again, whether you agree or disagree with everything that I've said, will be food for thought for you, bless you. And so again, language, images, and environment are kind of the three areas. And in a moment, I'll put up for those who are in the room some questions to think about, and Miles will be posting that for our Zoomers. And for those on Zoom, you'll be typing into a Google Doc, a Google Slide doc, that then we will be able to share up here. So we'll be able to see, those on Zoom won't be able to respond verbally, but we'll be able to read to the group some of the comments that you have. And those in here, obviously, you'll be able to share out. And I'll take some notes, or you can turn in whatever you're writing on, and I'll add that to the Google Slide. And then that way, at the end of the conference, we'll have, from both this session and the other session, the comments and thoughts from everyone on a Google Slide, so that way you'll have access to that, so you don't have to take notes necessarily about everything that everybody says, and you'll still have that, that information. Okay, so I'm going to share. And Miles, you can go ahead and take care of our Zoomers. Thank you. And we will, I'm thinking around 20 minutes or so. I always tell my students that when I hear the words, "So what are you doing this weekend?" that means that conversation has ceased. So if I hear you all talking about your weekend plans, then I'll be like, all right, it's time to come back. But roughly 20, 25 minutes is what I'm thinking. And I'm thinking 2 groups or 3, whatever, however you all want to do in here. But let me share that and share that. All right, so taking some time to introduce yourselves, and then any comments you'd like to bring up. But I hope that you're able to bring your own experiences and expertise in service in your schools. Again, even if it's just teaching about service, to be able to talk about those realities. And here's some questions. If you don't get to all of them, that's fine. Some may apply to your group and not to another group. And then for those in here, someone can take notes and kind of share out to everyone when you're done. So since we only have 2 groups, we can kind of handle this however you want. That's okay. You can share. That's great. Hey, I won't collect the notes and grade them. So we can do the sharing however you want. I hope that it seemed to me great conversations in both groups. That I hope it was helpful for you to share your experiences and thoughts with people from other schools, because we rarely get the opportunity to do that. And I'll just open the floor for anyone if you want to share. Obviously, if there's something that a fellow group member shared that you aren't sure if they want shared, honor that. Honor that. But if there's anything you want to share about the discussion from your context that you think would be helpful for the other group to hear, or anything that occurred, in terms of discussion that came up, anything that connected to the points on the board, or simply just about how service is done at your school, something that you found interesting that you would like to replicate. However it is, I open the floor for any comments or questions for each other.
One of the things that we talked about is, students choose our schools, right? And the competition can be fierce sometimes, and you want your enrollment to be strong. And so part of that is like the marketing team sharing these stories, right? And so I think all of us, also felt the way that you shared about your picture, where like we struggle with when the social media team asks us to take photos of students serving in places or something. And so we really talked about the importance of Taking I think I try to take photos of like just my students, but really how do we share these stories in a way where like the dignity of every person in the photo is kind of recognized and celebrated, and how do we maybe focus more on the reflection of the experience from the student and less on like this photo of like the good that our students are doing, because it's not about that, that's not the point, know. So
Yeah, we're constantly being told, send stuff so that we can celebrate our schools, because I think I heard somebody say all of our schools are really in competition for similar students, and so you want to say our service program does this, or we have trips that go here, or students are involved in the community here, and photos speak 1,000 words. But how do you, as Kristen said, how do you honor the reality of the person in the photo in a way that doesn't diminish their human dignity, at the same time demonstrates that your school is doing great things? I think it's a very difficult line to walk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but maybe schools need to come up with better marketing strategies in terms of like highlight other things, because like I like how you started and said like we don't need to talk about service as important. It's a given. Like that's kind of the starting point. So I think part of the frustration and like moving forward so that we aren't harmful and recognizing place is that like schools collectively deciding like we're not going to exploit people in that way or advertise service in that way. Like we're creative people. We've become even more creative in a pandemic. Like how do we move forward and say like there's other ways to advertise that without photos?
Mm-hmm.
And just asking more of each other and being better.
Someone in our group mentioned, like, when we're on this topic, to talk about using the social media to like advertise ways to get involved in the project. So not always necessarily using it as like, hey, we did this, but like, hey, we're looking for donations for this, or hey, there's an opportunity to sign up for this project. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a way to show that that's happening without like being like, hey, look how good we were when we did this thing. Mm-hmm. But like to get involved in it too.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking also, going off of that, like about the dynamics of our community and like the demographics of our community. Because at Cristo Rey, a lot of our students are serving each other and they're serving each other's families, and like it's not a matter of like us versus them, it's us serving each other. And so I think that's like a huge thing with like recognizing those differences in dynamics. Is the way that I kind of think about it is like othering those people. Is like you're serving them, or you're showing them, or you're doing all of these things and you're putting that divide between you and that person. And like even just recognizing like your own privilege and like where you're at. And just like there's just being in the midst of like my own year of service currently, and like the language that like other community members like in my program use, or that like my family and friends use. It just has put me in a lot of uncomfortable positions that have like made me think and like check what I'm doing. And being able to take a step back and like learn from others rather than like putting myself like first, like being able to take in what others need or what others say, and kind of like our keynote speaker was saying, walking with them and not like for them, and like listening to them. Because we can give food to a food shelter, or we can donate money, or we can do whatever we think is best, but that's not necessarily what's best for those people. Or even for each other. Like, I think that's another thing with college campuses. Like you were saying, how it's a matter of like serving your own community, and like there's people in your own community that are suffering and you're like exploiting them, or you're pointing them out. Yeah.
That's one of the challenges we've been discussing in this past year, is how do we serve the students within our school without embarrassing them, without making them feel uncomfortable. Where could we have supplies for them that they would, still feel dignified in getting the supplies or food that they need. And we haven't figured that out yet.
and going back to the language thing, one of the last things we talked about briefly, I mean, we're right now a 2-campus school. It's becoming a 1-campus school next year. But within the last 5 years, we developed an elementary school that is referred to by our school community administration and faculty as our mission school, across the street from our campus. And it's like, and we encourage our students to go to serve, to create relationships, but, we're handicapping relationship building by calling it a mission school, so, we need to reimagine that so that it opens the doors to relationships as opposed to, here we are to help you. It's like, well, here we are, we're all part of this school community. What can we do for each other?
Yeah, and just being able to form that relationship with them and like showing them that we're like at the basis of it, we're all the same.
Yeah.
Like we're all on the same level.
Yeah, we're all subjects, not the objects.
Yeah, we were talking about finding those similarities instead of like promoting and encouraging like differences. Like I'm super rich and you're super poor,
Right.
so I'm gonna help you. But like just like finding that common ground of like who we all are as people.
Yeah, because despite the fact that, on one hand, we keep saying the word community, on the other hand, we keep emphasizing a word that, puts barriers up there.
Yeah.
In your conversations, did anyone have any creative strategies, especially in terms of administration? There's administration and there's the faculty, whether you're at a college or at a high school. How to encourage a re-looking at some of the language used in the school, some of the images used by social media team, because as people in theology areas, campus ministry areas, you would hope that we could have input into these realities at our schools, but it isn't often the case. So has anyone either had an example of, presenting things like this to an administration for reconsideration, or any ideas about how to do that?
I can't offer a current, example of something we've done, but again, because we're in such a moment of transition, we do have a committee that's comprised of a lot of administrators and various other people of the school community, whose job is to relook at the mission and identity of the schools. And I think, going forward that, if we were to bring up ideas, and present the ideas with the hope that, this is a group of people who's been called to do just that, maybe we can offer an invitation, to consider these questions.
I agree with you. I think that, we were saying that we feel fortunate that the sisters who founded our school already have some of these views. But I think that if there was an administrative team that, we felt like the language piece needed to be shifted or the use of images needed to really be shifted, I think it's just kind of about like informing and advocating, talking to them about some of the topics you brought up today is just like a first step to starting the conversation of relooking. Because I do think that schools get in the rut of we've always done it this way, and until somebody makes them stop and say, wait a minute, you're gonna be in a van across the street, like people just do it and they don't think about it. So I think it's just taking the initiative to start the conversation.
And just like in the classroom, how when we plan something, we have to think like, how does this fit, my central idea or question that I'm presenting? Like, I think we have the language of the gospel to help us too. Like, how is this experience of watching these people in this van, like, how is this like gospel, and how is it not, And so I think we have that language and those stories kind of to ground us and to help us too.
I think realizing that we all make mistakes. There are a number of mistakes that I made that I was, trying to
And
share
thank
with
you for being humble enough to share those examples, Jimmy.
You're welcome. I'm a person full of mistakes. But I think all of us, realizing that we're all trying to grow and come to deeper awareness. And, as our speaker was saying earlier today, accompanying students, listening to them, I think that was a beautiful point that he made, that as we listen to the reality of what our students are going through and try to come to terms with what that means for the way we teach them, the way we accompany them, and realizing that, what we did 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago might not work today. And that was kind of my hope in terms of the environment component that we're constantly readjusting and reshifting in light of our current reality of our students in order to serve them and teach them. Any closing comments that anyone would like to add? Miles, was there anything people wanted to report? Okay.
Not that I've seen.
Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing this time with me. I hope that it was a workshop in the sense that you had a chance to listen to a few ideas that may have challenged something or given you some food for thought, and then a chance to discuss with each other. And I hope that the dialogue continues within your groups, that if there's something someone said, please feel free to reach out to them. This event, I think, is supposed to be about allowing people who are usually siloed. I mean, we're siloed in our departments at our schools, much less our school communities, much less the greater Cleveland community and beyond in terms of teaching theology, and just learning from each other, especially in the area of service and what it means to serve and accompany people in the world and our students. So thank you for coming and for your attentiveness.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Welcome.